So Dorset Humanists is not politically aligned. The humanist movement as a whole is not politically aligned, but humanists are interested in creating a better world and a society that works for the common good. That's the absolute unifying thing for us, a society in which everyone can flourish. I think we can all agree that the world in which we live is not currently ensuring that everyone can flourish. Some humanists may lean to the left, some humanists may lean to the right, and I see that you've arranged yourself accordingly. But I'm not sure which is right or left, so, you know. But those of you who are on the far side of each seating arrangement, you're obviously on the extremes. You're either far right or far left. Okay. So, yeah, so just to explain what we're doing in the schedule. So this month we've got some of our members talking about humanist perspectives from the left. In a month's time here, two of us will talk about humanist perspectives from the right or the centre-right. And then on Saturday the 13th of April, we've got a hustings event at Mordown Community Centre with real politicians or real parliamentary candidates for Bournemouth East. So they will be forming a panel so that we can throw missiles at them, or rather we can grill them on the kind of things that humanists would like to see in their manifesto. So that's the purpose of these exercises, is just to get our brains working on the kind of things that humanists would like to see politicians do in the upcoming election. Obviously, at the moment, we don't yet know the date of the election, unless anyone here has got inside information. I actually looked at all of the. In fact, I asked ChatGPT to predict the date of the election based on the typical month when we have an election. And going back to 1974, something like 9 elections in this country have been in May or June, and only 1 or 2 have been in sort of October, December. So I'm betting on summer. I think there'll be a snap election, but we'll see. Maybe wrong. Right, I'm nearly through my notes. Yeah, so for humanists, I mean, if we were to ask Humanist UK what sort of things should humanists be grilling politicians about, they might say specific things like bishops in the House of Lords, assisted dying, collective worship in schools, those kind of specific things that humanists and secularists have been campaigning about for a long time. But I'd like us to think a little bit more broadly about this, maybe things. I'm sure that there are all sorts of things that we can agree on, things like, the housing crisis and the economy in general, that we would like as humanists to see things better in this country. So, tonight we have got, can I say a bunch of lefties? Is that all right, Simon? or is that a little bit too polemical for this?
Well, that's a bit polemical, yeah.
we have got some humanists who are leaning to the left. Simon Bowden is going to start us off. Paul Entwistle, Roger Mann, John Kingston, Daniel Dancy. Is that everyone?
No, it's Daniel Moore.
Daniel Moore, okay. Oh, it was a different Daniel. I got you worried there, didn't I? Got you worried. Well, you see, I thought you were left wing, so anyway. And they're going to tell us what they think humanists should be saying to politicians this year in order to create a better society. So will you please give them all a really big welcome. Over to them.
Yeah, thank you, David. And so I've been given a bit of sound apparatus, but that's just for the film, Phil, is it? This isn't making my voice any louder. Right. Good evening. Thanks for coming. Tonight we won't be trying to tell you which way to vote in the coming general election, but we will be giving you a snapshot of our small left-of-centre humanist discussion forum. And you'll hear from 6 people who've joined in the project, known as the Practical Progressives Group, and 6 topics on which we managed to reach some joint conclusions. So a real sense of a little bit of progress. I'm one of the 2 founders of the group, And I'm going to explain why I think our viewpoint flows naturally from humanism. So it's a little personal story from me. I was brought up as an atheist from a toddler, and this made me feel very odd at school when the nun came round to say, you know, which church do you go to? Everybody say. So I had the feeling of some big moral questions that were going to come down on me always to answer. And I came from quite a left-wing family when I was young. My mum was an actual anarchist, member of the anarchist party. We went on ban the bomb marches. We went into mourning when Labour lost yet another election, 50s and early 60s. And I was brought up knowing that society was very unequal, and with the aspiration that we had moved towards a society where everyone was treated the same. By various means and strange paths, I won a scholarship to Oxford, and I was there from 1969 to 1973, a very politically heightened time. A lot of students there that I met in my college were much wealthier than me, but when we talked politics, their mantra seemed to be, we've got to smash the system. And then they'd say, forget Stalin and Soviet communism. We've seen the future. Here it is, Mao's little red book. You want to read this? And then they'd say, anyway, who's coming down to join the picket line at the Cowley Motorworks? They're out on strike again. They need our support. This is all your kind of well-heeled young Oxford students. Anyway, I decided, I read the Gulag Archipelago and little bits that made me think, I'm not sure about communism. So I reserved my judgment on these fashionable far-left ideas. But I was also struck by the heavy right-wing bias that was obvious in most of our newspapers. So I actually became a journalist. So I was thinking, I've got to find out somehow what's going on, what is right and wrong. I also followed my stepfather in going to Quaker meetings. It seemed to be a way to acknowledge some human values that you could call even sacred, but they weren't dependent on signing up for any creed or dogma. In particular, the Quakers were in favour of promoting peace and reconciliation, and quite a few of them went as far even as pacifism. And they had a mantra which was that of God. There is that of God in every man. In other words, it's a belief in the inherent worth of all human beings and that they all deserve to be treated with respect. So when I started coming to Dorset Humanist meetings, I assumed these would be the sort of values associated: a concern for the welfare of others and the desire to make the world a slightly better, fairer place. I heard there'd recently been a talk on Tom Paine and the rights of man, and that seemed an excellent starting point of how you think about our values. I think now, from my sort of elderly perspective, that most moral issues in reality come down to a tussle between what I feel is best for the world and other people, and against versus what I feel is best for me and my family and how we're going to get on. And that kind of little struggle. I think often the sane decision is finding your right balancing point between the two things. So in my case, I'm not going to give up using petrol or gas heating this year, but I may vote for politicians who'll do more to support international efforts to limit global warming. I will try to limit the number of times I fly on holiday. I'll try to use less cling film. I'll give a little bit of money to crowd justice to support cases against rich and powerful people who may be corrupt, but it's only possible to challenge them in our very expensive legal system if you've got funds to back you. But crowdfunding is a little opening for the small people to be a bit more equal with the big people. So I may give little bits of money to good causes, you know. where I find my balance. I think humanism gives us an amazing gift of intellectual and moral freedom, and the question is, what are we going to do with that? Personally, I think most humanists are seeking to build a moral understanding and are naturally reformist in outlook, rather than mainly seeking to improve their own wealth and social position. And if we're older and we own property, we've got quite a bit of that. Tonight, we're going to present some of the conclusions of the Practical Progressives, so please listen to the series of 6 mini talks that follow, with a brief time for audience responses after each talk. Really, I just want comments. I don't want the masquerade of questions. What do you mean by equality? Blah, blah, blah. You know, just want, you know, say your point. You're only going to be allowed to have one. This is quite brief. Boom, 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 boom. I'll cut you off. I'm the chair of the first half. I'll cut you off if you go off topic. If you say something that's much more important is beekeeping or something, I'll say, shut up. Okay, you're off. We're going to try to stick to the topic, you know, and so 10 minutes per topic, 5 minutes of audience stuff. And please bear in mind that each of us 6 has a slightly different viewpoint. We're not a political party. We're just 6 crazy individuals like all you lot, you know, but we have things in common, and there are, but we're not trying here to split Dorset Humanists into sort of the good people and the bad people or any of that. We're putting forward some very practical propositions that people have voted on. In a revolutionary step in these meetings, after 3 of these quickfire topics, we're going to have an interval, and there's going to be booze. And there's an honesty bowl where we're going to, you know, ask people to put in a £5 or a £10. I've got some £5s for change. If you're having a glass of wine or a bottle of beer, because the bar is a hell of a long way away, and we'll never do part 2 of the meeting if people. But it's also a chance to talk to each other for a quarter of an hour, you know, and then back into it. I think this evening we're going to have a political knockabout, and it's going to be fun. It's just, we're going to rattle through a lot of good stuff. Now, our first speaker and the first topic is the co-founder of our group and the intellectual powerhouse of much of what we do, Paul Entwistle. Thank you, Paul. All right. Oh, it's like that.
We practiced for hours.
Yeah.
Help with that?
If you wouldn't mind, David.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Well, good evening. Wow. I'm not an intellectual. You're going to be sick of me by the end of the evening, because I think I get 2 slots if time permits. The first one is primarily about proportional representation, and you can see we've got loads of notes supporting what I have to say. And there will be a brief introductory note from me, which isn't terribly informative. In fact, when I started thinking about it, I discovered that my past was much more interesting than I ever thought it was. But unfortunately, I can't get it all in. Anyway, I see that the programme states that I will make a brief personal statement, so I will, and provide a little bit of background, personal background. Although I should say I'm allowed a 10-minute explanation later on of my worldview, so in the second half of the programme, so there'll be more information there. I think I'm quite an unlikely lefty, having worked most of my life for American multinationals, in 2 cases as Director of Finance, so that's 2 reasons. I was lucky enough to go to an excellent direct grant school in Exeter. My parents were both very active liberals at the time. I can't quite call them young liberals, but they weren't that old either. Not much happened when I was at school, except it was a very good one and I was privileged. But I dabbled with Trotskyism in the 6th form, in an organisation then called the Socialist Labour League. I don't know if you've ever come across it, but it was run by an appalling man called Jerry Healy, who subsequently got taken to task for abuse and violence, and it didn't take me long to figure out he was a bit like that, so we parted company. So I do have some idea of how a revolutionary organisation operates, but we're not in one, as Simon has explained. I went to the London School of Economics and have always had an interest in left-leaning politics to study economics and computing. Now, LSE, of course, has a sound left-wing heritage, although ironically the largest student society when I was there was the Conservative Society, so don't believe all that you hear. As I said, my career was in US multinationals, so I'm privy to both the pluses and minuses of global capitalism. More recently, I've been interested in philosophy, and the rather more mature study of ethics and politics have surprisingly just reinforced my earlier student views. So I'm one of those whose practical political leanings have not changed with age. But it's time to move on to proportional representation. Now, some of you will know that I gave a rather longer talk on this sometime last year. Could I just ask for a show of hands to see how many people were there? So a fair proportion, but perhaps only around half. Okay. Well, I will start with a definition lifted from Wikipedia. Proportional representation is an electoral system under which geographical and political subgroups or parties in an electorate are reflected proportionately to the elected body. All votes contribute to the result. I don't expect that's news to very many of you. So here is some background and the key arguments. I've lifted this statement from an organisation called the Constitution Society, referencing the political philosopher John Stuart Mill, who was an influential early champion of PR. In a really equal democracy, every or any section would be represented, not disproportionately, but proportionately, he wrote in 1861. Adding that unless the minority was as fully represented as the majority, there is not equal government, but a government of inequality and privilege, contrary to the principle of democracy. And I think many of us would agree that perhaps we have a government of inequality and privilege at the moment. Put another way, this means that all voters should have an equal opportunity to affect the outcome of an election, which our system most emphatically does not do. It's not widely known that in 1917 the UK came within 7 votes of adopting PR. I certainly didn't know that until recently. Lloyd George and the Commons, up to their necks of course in vested interest on this subject, argued against. Whilst the Lords, perhaps not seeing the irony in their situation, argued for PR, but they were of course ultimately defeated by the Commons in 1918. Bringing us up to date, of around 120 countries aspiring to some form of democracy in the world, virtually all countries, except those which the UK have controlled in the past, have adopted a form of PR. So first past the post, which is of course the name for what we have, is very much a British disease, if you'll forgive me calling it that. Let us look at what are the key shortfalls in a first past the post system. First of all, it gives us minority governments. In the last half century, we have only had minority governments, and even apparent landslides like Thatcher and Blair and Johnson have only earned 44% of the votes cast. This is pretty tough on the other 56%. Similarly, many MPs have minority votes. Surely we need a system when more than 50% of the electorate actually want the parliamentarians and the parliament which they vote for. Again, as you probably know, first past the post gives a hefty winner's premium to ensure that these minority governments get 100% of the power when they are elected. I see this as bad in itself, but it also means there are big losers. Now, one of the biggest anomalies as an example, is the contrast between the Liberal Democrats and the SNP at the last election, whose results are wildly different simply because of the geography. The Liberal Democrats had 11.5% of the national vote and got just 1.7% of the seats. The Scottish Nationalist Party, with 1/3 of the number of votes for the Lib Dems, gets 4 times the number of seats. So an SNP vote is thus worth 12 times a Liberal Democrat vote, and the Lib Dems are effectively disenfranchised, all 3.6 million of them. This is not democracy, and there are plenty of other examples of that type. Partly as a consequence of what we just said, millions of votes are ignored. We surely want a system where all votes are seen to count. Obviously, turnout would improve if this were the case, when currently so many rightly complain that their votes are wasted. There was a Frenchman who I think operated in the 19th century, or possibly the early 20th, called Duverger, and he studied first-past-the-post systems, and he concluded that first-past-the-post degenerates into a perpetual two-party system because of the incentive not to waste your vote and therefore to vote, in our case, for Labour or Conservative. This effectively crushes new innovative parties and ensures moribund and conservative, with a small c, politics. Votes are widely distorted by tactical voting, meaning voters are compromising and not adopting their first choice of candidate. That issue, of course, goes away as well if you've got a proper system of PR. The next thing I want to draw attention to is our system where our parliaments are decided effectively by approximately 1/8 of the seats in what we refer to as marginal seats. One consequence of this is that all the effort in the hustings is put into those marginal seats. So 7/8 of the electorate in any election can be effectively ignored. And extra money and effort in marginals can seem pretty close to corruption, with frequent overspend by parties. Safe seats can have a very low turnover of MPs, and we can probably think of 1 or 2 not too far from here who've recently been kicked out, who've been in their seats for a very long time. And younger and more vibrant candidates, and dare I say perhaps more feminine candidates, will wait in vain for an opening. Under PR, new patterns of voting are encouraged and new parties have a chance of survival. Now, it is true that various forms of PR can seem complex, and only half of our group agreed on a preferred process, as you will be able to see in a moment. Right, thank you, Roger. However, rather than go into detail on that, I'm confident that since the rest of the world can handle it, that we can, when the time comes, come up with a suitable methodology for the UK. So, if I can summarise our conclusions. First past the post, in my opinion, denies us the essence of democracy. It also, in my opinion, crushes new blood, disenfranchises minorities, is easy to manipulate, governs by seesaw, and creates disaffection with politics, which I believe we see at the moment. In my opinion, again, we need deliberation, collaboration, negotiation, compromise, consensus, and a steadier long-term perspective. This would probably include citizens' assemblies to help determine policy, which, as you probably know, have been used successfully elsewhere. And we need vibrancy and not perhaps the sad picture we currently see. To conclude, a majority of the electorate are now in favour of PR, according to the Electoral Reform Society, and so are all political parties except the Conservatives, and of course Keir Starmer, who's obviously most focused on the next election. But in my view, PR's time has come. Thank you.
Right, so I'm chairing the first half of this meeting, and I'd like to invite very quick comments on this, after which we'll give Paul a minute's comeback, okay? Yeah, so lady there. You might want to stand up when you talk, just to make it, make it more fun for the audience. They can hear better. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can throw things at me. No, it's just that one of the, I'm totally in support of PR, but a lot of arguments are about instability of governments if you look across a European perspective, and I just wondered what your comments were on that, if I'm allowed to ask that sort of question.
Okay, any more? Because I think we're not going to do immediate.
No.
There will be at the end, if there's time, all 6 of us are going to come up. Aaron at the back, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just worried, can everybody win when there's a coalition government? And coalition governments, does anybody win, or is it just a watered down grey area that nobody wins?
Okay, good point. Any more comments before we move on? Dan?
So how do we combat extremism? The system of PR often tends to push people towards the fringes. What mechanisms could we put in place to stop that?
Okay, we're not going to answer each question, I think. We're going to just give everybody a chance to come out and then pull, yeah. So the other Dan, yeah.
I agree with Dan's point, actually, the other Dan. But my question also is, what route do you think Britain could go down to actually achieve PR, seeing as we've already failed one vote? Is there a way we could do it now?
Okay.
Every banks are flooded. How are we doing?
Yes, gentlemen.
It is a way of constructively costing multinational corporations, which you would know a lot about, because then they would have to buy 5 or 6 parties rather than 2. I know. It would make accounting easier, as you know.
Right, any more quick points? I think we only get one go each, okay?
That point's around.
Okay, so quick comeback, Paul. You're afraid you've got too much to come back on.
With keywords, if I stumble. Instability and extremism.
Yes.
There's one general answer which I have, which is most systems put a minimum level for participating in elected government. So that might typically be at a 3% or 5% of the electorate. Thank you, David. So that eliminates some proportion of, let's say, extreme people. I don't see why intrinsically the system should drive people to extremes. Keywords, anybody?
Instability.
Instability. Well, I think there are always examples. If you remember, we have about 40 countries using the British system because we made them, and about 70 or 80 who use various forms of democracy. They're not necessarily all 100% good at it. But it's very easy to find examples in 70 or 80 countries of places where things don't go terribly well all the time. But given that proviso of keeping extremists out, and you can make your own rule as to what percentage that will be, my personal view is that compromise and discussion is better than 100% of the power based on 44% of the people.
Right, I think we're going to leave it there for time. So we're going to move on to Roger now, who's been summarised our findings about the NHS. Barry, who gave the original talk to us about the NHS, unfortunately goes to the BSO every Wednesday night. So Roger is going to fill in for him. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to talk very briefly about the NHS. Many of you are aware, Barry, who's a retired surgery consultant, gave a very in-depth talk last month about the NHS, going into a lot of the problems, and he sort of led the discussions within our small group. I mainly agree with all of his points that the NHS actually does an amazing service for the amount of work it has to do. But, there are some slippages, there are a lot of areas that can improve. It seems to be getting a little bit worse. And I just want to go into some of the questions we discussed and sort of break them down and look at some of the opportunities, how we can improve. So the management health service should be taken out of the political arena. It's quite often referred to as the political bouncing ball. It's going from party to party without any decisions being made. And when we voted unanimously that we agreed with this proposition. And the ways I personally see how this could be implemented, at the moment the NHS is a complex network of different legal entities. You've got NHS England, you've got NHS Improvement, you've got the Care Quality Commission and Monitor, all doing separate things with no clear sort of line of command. And they're all accountable to the Department of Health and Social Care and governed by the rolling policy initiatives changing all the time. My view is all these separate legal entities could be streamlined and amalgamated into a healthcare conduct authority, which would be a similar legal framework to the Financial Conduct Authority, where it's independent. They have to provide performance reports to the government, but they're not accountable to one department who sort of mucks about with them all the time, with people who don't actually have any experience of running a complex service like the health service. They will be responsible for setting standards and regulating all health and social care providers, both public and private. And all private care providers would be required to pay a nominal subscription fee, the same way financial services that have to pay to the Financial Conduct Authority. And it would be relatively small staff numbers, but made up of medical professionals, economics, logistics, and analysts. The next question was, to avoid the current bed blocking crisis, there should be joint management and funding of the NHS and social care provision. So at the moment, I don't know if you know, the National Health Service, like mainly the hospitals and doctors, like classified as critical care, that they're funded and managed through trusts, where a lot of the social care is provided by lots of different organisations, managed through local councils and various stuff. So it's a sort of hodgepodge of systems going on. So I'm just losing my things. And I think joint management could be done by, at the moment there's 42 integrated care boards that were legally established in 2022 to provide sort of the regional framework. But the main problem with this at the moment is there's conflicting reporting lines with no real authority. So they have responsibility, but they've got no real... so it's a good idea, but it's poorly implemented because it's like sticky plaster over one idea on top of my idea. Well, actually, you know, just let's simplify the whole process. And the bed blocking it's a complex numbers problem, but this more integrated approach would help. And I think it needs a multifaceted approach: halfway homes, hybrid housing, assisted housing, care in the community, and it also needs, you know, data analysts and automation alongside personal care. So you don't want to take away the personal touch, but you need some sort of regular monitoring. So, you know, the personnel step in when they need to be, and people are going to be supervised. And at the moment, there are 84% of care homes are privately owned independent companies, that's over 10,000 providers. And the top 500 provide 500,000 beds. That's 500,000 beds, which is just 10% of the number of beds. And that actually costs the NHS, even though they're private, it actually costs the NHS 1.2 billion because they provide a lot of the auxiliary staff, they provide a lot of the nursing staff, and a lot of the equipment. So a lot of these companies are making a huge amount of profits, but 30% of their expenses are actually covered by the NHS. So the next question, okay, this is the, that was another unanimously 6. The next question we have. Britain should adopt the contemporary cover model for health provision used by, for example, in France and Germany, where there's a compulsory insurance-based payments based on income as well as public tax money. So it's like half and half. Some of the NHS is funded by the government, public funded. And again, there was a bit of a disagreement there within our small group. including myself, I wasn't convinced this was necessary. The reason I personally wasn't convinced was I think there's limited data to be able to make direct comparisons and inferences. I'm all about evidence-based results, and I wasn't convinced there's enough evidence to support. And we also discussed the idea of repeat offenders and a sense of entitlement that people go into if they feel that part of their income is going towards this, that they may be more demanding of services. And this is controversial, but personally I believe money is never the issue. It's more about resource availabilities and priorities within the government. The government, if need to be, can find the money available. And I also believe fundamentally access to healthcare should be universal and priorities based on clinical need and not financial worth. But I believe it could work, and one of the things we discussed, that the sort of insurance contemporary cover would need to be provided by a non-profit organisation rather than a for-profit money-making business. And ultimately the national insurance was meant to provide this alongside the pension schemes, but this is no longer sort of ring fence, so there are sort of schemes in place. How am I doing for time?
Yes, we need to rabbit on, yeah.
I need to rabbit on.
Well, I mean, we need to run on quickly, yeah.
So one of the things, I won't go into this into detail because this is quite a complex subject, and hopefully it's fairly explanatory that managers should undergo specific training and come into under the authority of a professional body, because you have the nurses become under authority, some of the logistical staff and the doctors become under authority, but the management quite often aren't trained, or in management there are certain transferable skills that could be applied to any job role, but there are specialist skills that are needed. And one of the things we discussed is creating a professional body to train managers for the medical profession, both within the NHS, but also we can use it as a to outsource and develop skills around the world and that sort of stuff. Let's make sure I covered all my points here. And there's also the idea that comes from Japanese Hoshin Kamin, which means management principles of empowering everybody at every level. So a lot of times management is seen as a higher tier when actually it should be the doctors and nurses, like through a continuous improvement program, empowered to make the changes they need to be, rather than having to wait it from on high, which don't have the experience to make real changes that actually benefit the hospitals and the customers, the patients. So that was fairly unanimous. And one of the things Barry was particularly passionate about was this idea of no-fault system for dealing with legal medical claims. About 10% of the budget of the NHS, 1% of the budget, which is 2.5 billion, goes into legal claims. And the idea is to, instead of it being at the individual level, standardise it across the board. We recognise that patients, family and friends are obviously advised that they are aware of risks and that stuff, but sometimes negligence and mistakes happen and they need to be compensated sometimes for lifelong care. And so compensation be independently standardised across the board without a need for a judicial system for every individual case. So doctors, and one of the other benefits is doctors and medical staff will then be free to talk about the incident and practice and processes to be improved without fear of medical insurance going up, and that could be used as a learning mechanism. And one of the things that the healthcare authority I discussed earlier that would be one of its roles, is to standardise this process. One final question. There should be token charges made by visiting your GP or going to acts in emergency with the non-urgent issues. And there was a slight disagreement with that. I personally wasn't convinced because I think it risks of creating a just-in-time medicine. So people wait until it's a genuine emergency when they'll get it for free. So I think, I'm not saying that would happen in all cases, but I think it could be costly to implement. And I think more data is needed to better understand this ever-increasing demand being made before one can make an informed choice about, by ever-increasing demand, there's about less people are setting, for discomfort, but is this offset by operations being quicker? And what is the impact on depression, anxiety, malnutrition, obesity, substandard housing like black mold, having on healthcare services? These things need to be looked at. And we need to better understand the cost benefit of healthcare becoming more proactive rather than reactive. That's it. That's it. Oops.
Are you happy to end there?
Yeah, I'm done. That's it. I've done, literally.
Give up. So, so another brief opportunity for audience to come back. I'll just fill out a couple of things. I think on the bed blocking, because there's a completely different financial system for care compared to the NHS, something like a third of hospital acute beds are blocked because there's nowhere to put people. So that's it is a huge problem, this. The other point I make is the really controversial idea that Barry had, which is that we should have a system more like France or Germany with an element of private insurance, was that the plus side of that is you get about an extra third of money coming in for a whole lot of extra beds, doctors and nurses. But it's not so equal. It's not such a good socialist idea. So really interesting dichotomy that was, not surprising we were split. But any quick points from the audience?
I'd just be interested to know if Barry supported the idea of this token charge for GP and A&E.
I don't think he did necessarily. But I mean, he was very worried about the sense of just the unhappiness of a lot of health staff. Not just going on strike or going to work in Australia, but a sense of being overwhelmed by the pressure and rather sometimes very dictatorial managers who didn't know what they were talking about. So it was looking at ways of not making it like people getting buried under a torrent of news.
I mean, to fair, you raise a good point. I think Barry was fairly neutral. I mean, he raised the idea and he wanted to make a comparison saying, well, actually, the NHS used the envy of the world, but other countries seem to be, having a higher standards at the moment, and he was wanting to better understand why. So he wasn't for and against it. He was just mooting the point, raising it as a question. That's the way Barry often does.
Right, lady there.
Sorry, it's me again. One of the things that's really important, I mean, I worked in the NHS for 30 years.
Yeah.
I was a manager, but I was informatics and stuff, not direct clinical care. But for me, it's about the public health side of things. And we didn't actually touch on the preventative, the education, and, it's all about the end point. Whereas actually, I think there's so much that could be done very productively about public health, and particularly my pet thing is about using informatics to be able to identify specific families, individuals, whatever, who actually need intensive support. And they use, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but I know how much a small number of individuals can use a disproportionate amount of resources. And if we can only really support those people to live, and they're usually people that the police know and social services know. So for me, public health and supporting public health would be a crucial thing in, it's not about the end, it's about the beginning for me.
Okay, stopping you there, but
sorry.
I think relating what Barry was saying, as an overview, was that because the NHS is a political football, and the only first past the post, you bounce from one big party to the other, they both blame the others, and then they set a target, which is what so they're not looking at these much more important long-term issues. So his idea of taking it out of politics, having a panel of experts who do a long-term policies for the NHS, you know, it's a much more effective and subtle way of dealing with it, rather than, you know, one or two targets which allow people to score political points. Okay, any other questions?
I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but of course one reason we have a problem with beds is because we have fewer beds than a lot of similar countries.
Yes.
Fewer doctors.
Well, fewer beds.
We currently have a record level of people who are economically inactive due to long-term sickness, which I think is also related to the housing crisis that you mentioned. But I don't think that having people charged to see their doctor will improve that situation. I think it'd be worse for our economy to discourage people from going to the doctor.
Yeah.
Just a quick observation. Doesn't it strike anybody as odd that given the improvements in medical treatment, the improvements in public health and blah, 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 more people are sick, more people are dying. It's not doing a very good job, is it, considering it's the envy of the world?
We haven't put any money in.
We
haven't.
Well, we put all the money in the wrong places. But at the moment we're running at 14% higher death rate than over the last 60 years. We're losing 100,000 people a year, more than we were in 2019. And we've got a multi-billion pound health service that isn't even interested in asking why. That's 100,000 people. It's quite a lot of people that are dying, and nobody knows
I just come
why.
a quick look.
But interesting, no one's even asking the question.
Actually, I disagree with that. So I don't think the death rate has actually changed that much over the last 10 years.
13%.
Okay, gentlemen there.
In my view, the NHS should switch dramatically to prevention rather than cure, and that would save huge amounts of money in the long term. Because politicians and because the NHS manages anything short term, it doesn't happen.
Somebody at the back, was there? Yeah, Maureen?
The health service is interested in what the gentleman outlined, and there's lots of research bodies like the King's Fund that investigate why, and they do know why, and the health service is underfunded. And in terms of public health, unless we address poverty, the health service and public health can't sort this out.
Yeah.
The underlying thing, poverty and inequality is an influence.
Any more? Or no? Yeah, one more.
If we were to adopt a no-fault system for dealing with medical
negligence claims,
etc., how would we then deal with specific cases of incompetence or pure malice, as there has been occasional cases?
Do you want to do that, Roger? Or
I don't need an answer now, it's just a,
okay.
a question thrown out.
Yes, I mean, I'll tackle your point first. I think it literally won't be no blame. Obviously, if doctors, or whoever they are, do something negligent or deliberately malice, they will obviously be accounted for, and training, discipline, fired and various other stuff. All that will be happening. It just won't. It will just be an there'll be a standard person where if that happens, it won't be, on an individual basis. Well, in those cases, there'll be a review committee and that kind of stuff. Within the structure of the NHS, it won't go to like court cases and various other stuff, and depending on who has the best lawyers and that kind of stuff. It's about it'll be separating, compensating the patient with dealing with the incident. That it will separate those two. So that obviously there'll be internal reviews and that kind of stuff, and whether disciplinary process is needed, and whether there will be a simplifying or whether civil action, criminal action is needed. But that will be separate from dealing with the trauma of the patients, if you see what I mean.
Right, I think we've got to end it there. No, we are running out of time. Okay, so one final question.
Yeah, I just want to say Barry drew the comparison between the NHS and the aircraft industry, where they instantly just get the facts and then bother to blame the sign.
Yeah, precisely. I was thinking that in the adversarial system, where it's a kind of legal contest, A, it's incredibly expensive. B, nobody's allowed to talk. You can't say, well, I admit, we left all the equipment inside the belly of the... you have, in the same way that you have a car crash and your insurance company says, don't say anything, don't admit fault. This is going to be a legal contest. There's far less ability, it's much more expensive, and you can't learn from mistakes. Of course, dangerous or criminal doctors and nurses have to be sacked and prosecuted. Right, we are going to move on to the really central topic of equality and democracy. And John Kingston.
Take it away.
So now the simplest one.
John, let me just pop that on.
Oh, yes.
Thanks.
Democracy and equality in 10 minutes. If we start with what I'm going to talk about very, very, very briefly is a little bit about equality first. What sort of equality? There are a lot of people mean very different things when they use the term equality. And why equality is desirable, comparative equality is desirable. And then a little bit about democracy. What is democracy? And in particular, what I'm interested in is why doesn't democracy, if it's working properly, deliver more equality than we have? And then that leads on to recommendations as to what might change. So equality, I mean, clearly we're not talking about the sort of equality, equality can be thought of in mathematical terms, everything having to be equal, and we don't want that. We don't want absolute equality in terms of incomes. We would like equality, most of us, in terms of opportunity, but what does that really mean? You can try to work towards that in terms of providing books for people, libraries, providing better education and so on. But you're never actually going to get total equality of opportunity because from a philosophical point of view, of course, you've got the problem that people are born with different abilities. And so is it fair? Most of us would say it's not fair to have one person going to a really bad school and one person going to a really good school. But you could also make an equal case that it's not really fair that somebody is born with a better body, a muscular, more muscular body or something, whatever, and or more intelligence, which will also, that's another form of equality. What I'm interested in, though, and the sort of equality that I'm going to talk more about is equality of outcome more than equality of origin, of how you are to start with, and schooling and so on. There's a book which probably many people will be familiar with here. It was published quite a long time ago, but it's been updated since. The Spirit Level. Now, the Spirit Level shows pretty amazingly, actually, the extent to which relative countries around the world which are relatively more equal, with more equal societies, equal in terms of outcome, wealth and opportunity, wealth and living standards, are better in many, many, many ways. And it came as a big surprise, in fact, to the authors when they found this out. So you can't see this, and unfortunately we haven't got any slides. But this is a graph which is the summary of what a lot of this book is about, which takes into account lots of indexes: life expectancy, maths, ability of maths and literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, drug, alcohol, addiction, social mobility. So just about everything you can think of that's desirable, or on the other side that's undesirable. And it tracks the level of equality of a lot of representative countries around the world, and looks at the relative position of those countries against a combination of all these indices. And surprise, surprise, you find that the most equal societies have the lowest incidence of the bad ones of these qualities, and the highest incidence of the good ones. Yeah. So in all sorts of ways, whether it's in health, whether it's in psychological well-being, general societal qualities, it's better to be, even if you're rich in a very unequal society, you suffer from it being a very unequal society. And so examples, I mean, it won't come as much surprise perhaps to hear that the Scandinavian countries are down the bottom here. The very bottom in terms of the most equal is Japan, of the major societies. Up the top here, close to the top, is the UK. Portugal, actually, surprisingly, is slightly worse than the UK, and of course the worst of all is the USA. And so the USA and UK have so many more problems of all the sorts that I was talking about than more equal societies. Now, I don't want to go into well, I haven't got time to go into equality in any more detail than that. I'll move swiftly on to democracy, because democracy, one might think that democracy, if it was working properly, would, by its nature, lead to a more equal society. Indeed, if you look at the early 19th century, for example, early mid-19th century, when, for example, the people who were massacred at Peterloo, the Peterloo massacre, which was immortalised by Shelley in his poem, they were wanting democracy. They were wanting one person, one vote, and they saw that as a way of getting a more equal society. And if you think about it, of course, one person, one vote, there are a lot more poor people than there are rich people in the world. In fact, Steve was saying just a moment ago that at a John McDonnell meeting that he went to yesterday, there was the statistic that 1% of the population of Britain own 70% of the wealth. And it's getting worse, of course. Now, the 70% have 70 times as many votes as the 1%. So why is it that our democracy doesn't lead to more equality? Ken Loach said at a talk in Bournemouth earlier this year that the wealthy classes, or the establishment of Britain, are very happy to have democracy. They're very happy to have changes of government, as long as each government is the same as the previous one. And that's very much the way, the place we're in at the moment, I think.
John, but we are kind of behind time. Could you go on to the propositions, because you've got a lot of propositions.
Right, okay.
The propositions and the votes.
Right, okay. I mean, what I want to say, just to sum up, to finish the bit about democracy, is that it's an imperfect democracy, largely because it's being captured by the elite. And if you look at the position of the elites in terms of the proportion of people who attended fee-paying schools, public schools, private schools, and the proportion of people who attended Oxbridge, it is just mind-blowing, really, what proportion of the people who control our country in terms of the senior judges, the senior civil servants, MPs, cabinet, and so on, the people who start off with going to private schools and going to Oxbridge, as of course you did. You're not typical, are hugely disproportionately represented. Right. So, if we look at this, and I need probably to go closer to it.
I think it's written on somewhere on
it's written
that you put down there.
Yeah, there's a sheet there.
On the question, so you don't have to see the screen actually, but just give the issues and the vote.
Okay.
All the questions up.
Yes, I mean, I came up with in the talk that I gave, I came up with a lot of proposals, of which this is a subset. But digital targeting of political propaganda is one that gets more and more discussion, of course. So in the last, well, not just the last general election here, but in America, even more so perhaps, elections are more and more influenced to an incredible extent, in fact, by the targeting of propaganda through social media. So it's not just that everyone gets, I'm on Facebook, so that doesn't mean that I get the same propaganda as you. It's targeted at people in particular constituencies who have particular thoughts and so on, and it's amazingly successful. So
can you concentrate on the questions and the votes, because it's
the votes? I'm sorry. Okay.
Because it shows that you won these arguments.
Yeah, all right.
The proposition and the vote.
So the proposition is that we regulate in some way the targeting of political propaganda, and most people agreed with it. As is the.
Can you read them out, John?
So introduction. I'm sorry. Introduction. Okay.
So on here somewhere that.
Yeah. It's.
Okay. Here we go. So you can read it off there, and then the votes, and then people get the core points. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But then I'll have to have my glasses on. Introduce digital democracy to make it easier to vote. Now, it is extraordinary at the moment that it's how primitive our voting system is, that people have got to turn up at church halls or whatever to vote, which is bad enough, but it's actually being made more difficult, or was made more difficult in the last election, of course, by the fact that we now need ID as well. Which wipes out the ability of it makes it more difficult for younger people and less educated people generally to vote. So we want to make voting easier, basically, right? So again, 6-1. Tax. We clearly need to tax wealth. Now, tax in this country is overwhelmingly applied to income rather than to wealth. And the greatest inequalities are in wealth rather than in income. I mean, both are very unequal, but wealth, the extent to which wealth, I mean, by its nature, it builds up, and of course builds up generation after generation, which brings up the question of inheritance. But certainly the Labour Party at the moment has specifically said that they're not going to introduce wealth taxes, and I think they should. And among our little group, it was a 7-0 vote in favour of doing that. Multinational companies make huge profits. Now, this is an international problem, obviously, not just a problem here, but make huge profits in Britain, and in the problem is that the tax is not charged where the profits are made. They manage to arrange their businesses such that, in the theory, the profits are made in a country which has no taxation at all, rather than the country where it's made. So this is something that, again, was unanimously agreed. Going back to, this is really going back to democracy, that the present government has continued the trend, but accelerated the trend to restrict the right to peaceful protest. And there's a lot at the moment in the media about, for example, the Palestinian protests, saying, "Oh, this is terrible. We shouldn't, people should be put in prison if they climb up on national monuments," and absurdities, even if those monuments are to peace, and the demonstrations are for peace as well. So I think we need to allow people to protest. Right?
Yeah, there was some ambivalent answer.
There was a
0.5
of a person.
People invited to vote by email after the meeting, so time for thought, and they could put yes or no or NA if they thought the question was a bit dodgy, so we have ended up with quite a lot of these 0.5s for different reasons. Yeah, or people said yes, but, and went on for a page, so that's why there are some half votes in there.
Yes, it's not somebody with half a brain, perhaps, but I don't know. I shouldn't say that, sorry. Wipe that from the record. Right, number 6 is simply, do you agree that health and social problems are generally worse in countries with higher inequality? And that's what I was talking about with the book. And everyone agrees that that is the case. I don't think there's... it would be very difficult not to. Now, the number 7, Britain's elite are disproportionately drawn from private schools, grammar schools, and Oxbridge. Yes, I hadn't mentioned grammar schools. Most places in the country, of course, don't have grammar schools, but we, in this part of the world, still do, in Poole and Bournemouth. And although grammar schools aren't as bad as private schools are in terms of the concentration of people who get to the top, they're still not great. Having been to a grammar school myself, and my children all having been to grammar schools, but that doesn't, it's not good. So what should we do about it? We should broaden. I mean, what's said here is not actually what I said in my original talk, but. Should we greatly widen access to the best education? Well, I don't think anyone... Well, yes, yeah. I was going to say I don't think anyone could disagree with that, but one person did and 2 people abstained. So I was talking about abolishing private education altogether, which is more controversial. Now, should we replace the House of Lords with a smaller second chamber elected or independently chosen? I think that the House of Lords has obviously been reformed, and the number of people who are hereditary Lords who are members of the House of Lords is greatly reduced. But if you look at the appointed Lords, they are appointed, and they're appointed by political parties, and they're appointed in many cases on the basis of their political contributions to the party that's in government, which it's very difficult to avoid saying that that's generally the Conservative Party that does this most, but both parties really, both of the main parties are bad. Finally, reform of financing of political parties to make it fairer. Now, we didn't come up with a completely fair system, and it's difficult to, it's not a straightforward thing, but it's clearly wrong that large companies and rich people, on the one hand, should be able to buy influence, and buy influence partly directly from being allowed to have meetings with cabinet ministers or whatever if they contribute enough money, but also just indirectly the fact that if you are able to give millions of pounds to a political party, then that political party is more likely to get elected, and that eats away at democracy. On the other side, of course, people say the same thing about trade unions and the Labour Party, and I think that there's a very good case for reducing although the Labour Party, we should recognise, of course, was originally the party of the trade union movement, but none of the political parties should be in the hands of any particular group. And so, in general terms, what I'd like to see is public financing of political parties. It's just how that happens is not obvious. That's it.
So, I mean, that's great. A massive, great programme there, and you can see the way John persuaded us on most of this. Can we have the break now rather than because we can chat in the break. We do have quite a lot. We've got 3 more topics to get through.
Yeah.
But yeah, brilliant talk, John.
Just a quick word on the second half. Like a bunch of idealistic lefties, we have of course run out of time, and so we have 3 more talks to fit in by 9:30. So we're going to slightly up the pace, and what we're going to try and do is ask each person to deliver quite promptly. We won't have any questions. If there's time at the end, then the 6 of us will line up here and you can attack us from every angle. So I'm sorry it's worked out like that, but that's the only way to get through it. So, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Right, I was talking to the practical progressive groups about modern money theory or modern monetary theory, which believes that the 3.8 trillion pound debt, the private debt that we've got through the banks lending and putting people in debt, that the rises in child mortality that John's been talking about and the Spiro level talks about, all these are attributable to the government policy of assuming that governments have a pot of money and when it runs out they can't do anything. Now I was trying to explain that there's no such thing as a pot of money. Money is debt, and the debt creation system has 2 factories. The factory which all of us are familiar with is the commercial banks. They make a loan, and that creates new money, and you repay it. When you repay your bank loan, the bank doesn't accumulate that money that you repay it. It no longer exists. It writes down that loan, and it disappears. Why do the banks give you a loan if it's going to disappear when you pay it back? Because they charge you a fee, normally in the form of interest. That's where they get their money from. So the money factory is the commercial banks making money. And of course, when the commercial banks lend us money to buy existing stuff, to buy existing houses, then that puts the price of houses up. When they lend us money to buy consumer goods that have already been produced, that will put the price of consumer goods up. So it's potentially inflationary. When banks create money for businesses to invest and to make stuff, then the money that's coming into existence before it disappears when the loans are repaid, that is money creating stuff, that is not inflationary. So that is good. Now, the other type of money, now the problem is with private money that the banks create, is society as a whole can never accumulate any savings. You or I can have an individual surplus in our account by spending less than we earn. But all of us all together can't spend less than we earn, because if we do, there's not enough spending to buy the stuff that people have produced, and they start laying off workers, and the economy goes down the tubes, and you get recession, and like they had in the Great Depression in the 1930s. The only body that can create money which doesn't have to be paid back, and the only body throughout history that has created money which doesn't have to be paid back, is the sovereign, the king, the ruler, or the government, depending on what state you're in. The government doesn't lend money, it creates money. It creates money, and that is what enables us as a whole to have savings, because most of us, we don't want to have to spend every single thing that we earn. We like to keep a bit aside. We as a whole can keep stuff aside so long as the government is spending more than it's taking back. How does the government take back? It takes back in taxes. Taxation is like the repayment of a loan. The government doesn't tax and then spend, because it can't take back tax unless the money has been spent. So it is spend and then tax. To give you an intuitive idea of why this is true, you know the word tax revenue. Revenue is French, revenir, it means to come back. Tax revenue is money coming back. When the money comes back, it's destroyed. It no longer exists. And indeed, when we've societies where we can see historically when they first set up money, you could see in the colonies in the United States, when they started issuing their own currency, they used to pay it out and then to show the people that they were destroying it, because if they don't destroy it, there's too much, and then you get inflation, they would burn it. That used to be known. But nowadays we've got this myth that there's pots of money around, nobody seems to know where they come from, and that the government's run out or the country's run out and they can't spend anything. And my view, and the view of quite a few progressive or left-wing economists, is that this is the problem, and austerity is a political choice, not an economic necessity. So that's the basic plot in a nutshell. So now let's go through some of the questions that we put. So the first question is it better for banks to lend money to firms that produce goods or services rather than mainly lending for existing assets, houses, for example, that already exist? And the answers to that, I think we had a majority on that. 6 yes, no 1. Right, okay. And the next question was, should the government use... Hang on, can you just put up the minute? Should the government use tax incentives to improve the balance of lending? The balance of lending is here referring to what are the commercial banks creating loans, creating new money, creating private debt for? Are they creating it, as I said earlier, to produce stuff, so that we raise our standards of living by producing more stuff? Are they creating it so that we train more doctors so we have more health provision? Or are they lending money for existing stuff? And should we have tax incentives to try and prevent them lending just for existing stuff, which is inherently inflationary? The answer to that was yes.
Steve,
yes.
Could you give the current balance? Because that was a shock to us, wasn't it? The current balance of lending.
75% in the UK, 75% of money that was created between, I can't remember the dates now, 2010 and 2019, it is for the purchase of existing assets. Only 15% of the money that's created by the banks when they lend to us goes into producing wealth. Whether that wealth is the production of services such as health provision or the building of new houses, that's good, that's wealth creating. Only 15%. So that was what this is about. Number 3, should the government broadly seek to balance tax and current account spending over the economic cycle to preserve the international value of the currency? That's a complicated question. I'm not going to try and go into that in depth now. But basically, the current account when the government spends, it commonly refers to 2 types of government spending. Current account spending, which is referring to all those of you here who've got a state pension. That's current account spending, right? Welfare for the sick, that's current account spending. Should it balance between what it spends on that, because that's inherently inflationary. Paying pensioners for doing sweet FA is inherently inflationary of itself, right? I'm not saying it's not essential, but it's potentially, not inherently, potentially inflationary. Should we have a balance between current account spending over the economic cycle, and the government should look at current account spending versus investment, right? So when the government spends on new roads, HS2, or whatever, new hospitals, that is capital account spending, not current account spending. So we were a bit, was that 3 yes, no, 4? Yes.
So that was just talking about current account. Should it?
Yeah. You see, I'm not sure that when we voted on that, we all knew what we were talking about, because when I looked at the question last week, I thought, well, what was I talking about when I was talking about that? So I've explained what I should have been talking about. Whether I made it clear or not at the time, I'm not sure. Right, let's go on to the next question. Should the government be free to increase the national debt to fund long-term infrastructure projects and capital spending? In other words, not current account spending, but should we increase the amount that the government spends above what it takes back in taxes, which is misleadingly called debt, because it's not debt like our debt to the banks is when we borrow from them. Should the government be free to spend more for long-term infrastructure projects? How do we reply to that? I think I've got
6.5.
Nearly all yes.
It's the person with half a brain who abstained.
That was probably me making some qualification, which I won't go into. Interest rates and inflation. Should the government raise interest rates to deal with inflation? I pointed out that raising interest rates is more liable to increase inflation than reduce inflation. There are a number of reasons for this. Some of them are obvious. If interest rates go up, our mortgages go up, rents go up, so that part of our inflation costs go up. What are called future contracts. That's what people agree now to pay for in the future, because contracts are priced in the future, so that's called forward pricing. It puts up forward pricing. It does little to reduce inflation, because the extra interest, right, that is taken from the borrower goes directly to the lender. So we were talking about whether interest rates should put up interest rates to deal with inflation. 2 of us thought yes, 5 of us thought no. 6, yeah.
1 minute if possible.
1 minute more. Should governments use fiscal measures to deal with inflation? Should we use taxation instead of interest rates? That was 4 in favour, 2 against. Number 7, should governments leave inflation to correct itself? Yes, 1, no, 6. I was arguing that it should, but I would need to qualify what I mean by that, which I haven't got time to do now. Number 8, should we be seeking to preserve a balance between private money creation and government money creation? Yes, 4, no, 0, abstain, 3. It's worth pointing out that after the only time that we've had sustained private sector growth in excess of 2.5% for any period is when government debt is rising faster than private debt is rising. So government debt historically has been the friend of private investment and capital, totally contrary to what most mainstream economists will tell you, because they look at ideology rather than data. What's the next one? Number 9. Do low interest rates lead to faster economic growth? We all know that they put up interest rates to try and slow inflation, which it doesn't necessarily do. They bring down interest rates to create faster economic growth. Basically, low interest rates empirically, historically, there's no direct relationship between lower interest rates and economic growth. Japan has had low interest rates at 0 for over 20 years now. It has no inflation, which according to all the economists it should have. Argentina has faster economic growth. It has interest rates of over 100%, or 90%, somewhere around there, and it has inflation of 100%. So I was making the point that the conventional narrative on interest rates is at best irrelevant and at worst back to front. There you go.
I'm really sorry.
That's it.
Thank you very much. And the next topic is housing from Dan. Thank you very much.
Steve, let me just take the from you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to pop this
yeah,
on.
yeah, please. Appreciate it. I didn't actually give the talk to the Practical Progressives, but I would encourage anyone to come on down and speak to us at some point. It was fantastic. This talk was by Kathy. So I'm just going to be speaking about a little summary about what she told us and a little bit of my kind of personal perspective on the whole thing. So I'll try and be very quick because, of course, we are a little bit short on time. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the importance of housing, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the scale of the problem. So in typical left-wing fashion, I see a lot of the housing crisis through the lens of class. So class, most people would agree, is made up of 3 types of capital. So you have economic capital, which is your access to finance. There's social capital, which is who you know. There's cultural capital, which is what you know and how you act. Okay? So housing controls 2 of those. So that would be the economic and the social. Without real estate, you may not have access to financial security or social mobility. So, as housing is essential for living in society, in order to vote, in order to get a bank, in order to get a job, anything like that, you must have a house. The cost of housing is inelastic. Whatever the cost of rent is, you have to meet it in order to partake in society. Right? So for a lot of us, that means we don't actually have an option. We have to meet the cost of rent. So this has led to the average private renter paying more than 1/3 of their income to a landlord. While the landlord gains extra economic capital from their growing equity in their property, as well as obviously getting the rental money itself, the tenant doesn't have the same kind of opportunity. So they combined with growing property values, this has led to increased inequality and a lack of financial security for a lot of tenants. The social capital element comes into play when we start thinking about the insecurity of housing. So at the moment, there's something that exists called a Section 21, which is a no-fault eviction. The idea of this is that a landlord at any point can give 2 months' notice and evict any tenant without any reason. This means that it's quite hard for a lot of tenants to build up their own kind of social capital, their own networks, their own, for instance, if you were investing long-term in your career and you're trying to build in a specific job in a specific area, you might not know whether in 2 months you're going to have to leave that area. I know this from my own experience with trying to fight a Section 21 over in Poole, where I found I wouldn't have been able to afford to pay rent to any other property in the area because the house prices had gone up quite so much. And I think this is a very common experience for a lot of people, particularly young people, in this area. So the dream of the security of that financial security and security of that social security is kind of all tied up for a lot of people in home ownership. So the dream of home ownership is quite far away now. This is in due part to the a weak financial sector with really high interest rates. Rightmove had, I believe the average in 2022 was 5.08%. And it's also down to house prices. The average house in the southwest is 407k, and that's in 2022. The average house price in the southwest in 2010, adjusted for inflation, was 384k. So, in our Practical Progressives talk, we had quite a wide range of thought about the solutions to all of this. I think most people now agree that the housing crisis is here, there's a real problem, and the impact of it is huge. However, there's a lot of different ideas about how we can resolve it. So, Kathy spoke a little bit about the right to housing and the kind of philosophical ideas around why people need housing. We talked a little bit about the shortages of supply, about the history of social homes and how they were often lived in by doctors and highly paid professionals. We spoke a little bit about the government's lack of willingness to borrow in order to build and push towards progress against this housing crisis. And all of our discussions led to some consensus on some bits, but it was very mixed. So most of the areas where we were speaking about regulating the market came to some kind of agreement. Most of the areas that started to encroach on private property, we did not agree quite so much. So we'll go through these. I have terrible eyesight, so I'm going to get really nice and close here. So, first proposition was to scrap the hope value given to landowners when their land is bought for development. So any profits made off of the house price and the value of the house increasing would then go to the local community, for instance the council, to run services. We had 6 people agreeing to that and no one saying no and no one abstaining, so everyone was a big fan. The next point was that we should be prepared sometimes to build on the green belt, often a very controversial issue, but had nearly unanimous agreement with 5 saying yes and 1 saying no. And can I have the next one? Bring in light touch rent controls to ensure rents are affordable, going back to the problem that I was talking about earlier about the very quick increase in house prices. We had 6 saying yes, no one saying no. If landlords are driven out of the market, make public funds available to buy some of these properties to be rented out in the public sector. And can we have the next one? And that was very agreeable to everyone. Make public funds available to build much more social housing, counting this as an investment rather than a current account. So let's have the next one. And that was, everyone agreed to that. Again, going a little bit back to Steve's point. Allowing housing associations to raise money on the open market to increase investment in housing. Again, very agreeable. Put severe limits on the right to buy to social housing or council housing. And that was 5 yes, 1 no. Of course, this has led to a lot of the problems around the housing stock because we're selling social housing far faster than we're building it.
1 minute, please.
Thank you. Put higher taxes on second homes and even higher when they're left empty for long periods. 6 saying yes. You can now legally, I believe, put triple the council tax for an empty second home. But councils have to agree to it. Have a new tenants' charter to provide more rights and security for renters, including ending Section 21 and more money for enforcement of rules. And that's very agreeable. And have we got any more? No, we have 1 more. It's a surprise to me. Do you believe that serious social unrest will follow unless the problems in the housing market are rapidly solved? We had 3 yes and 3 no. I think we were speaking earlier about how we could write our own answers, and I put yes times 1,000. So. And then we'll just wrap it up, shall we?
Yeah. Okay. Well done, Dan.
Thank you.
And finally, we come full circle, and Simon is back to the fore to talk to us about unions.
Right, so
microphone change.
What about costume change?
So this is about trade union powers. You know, it's another very central topic for the left and a very controversial one. The talk we had was given by a most lovely bloke who is a local Dorset guy, who's a campaigning member, Gareth Jarvis, campaigning member for the Socialist Workers' Party, so way left of the Labour Party. He was an unrepentant Marxist and explained to us that the laws of history would inevitably lead to the feudal system, being replaced by the capitalist system, but ultimately you're going to get the dictatorship of the proletariat. And this will be a very, very happy state of society. It would never change. It would be the kind of the end of history. So that was Gareth's view. Now, Gareth's not a regular member of our group, which is mainly, I would say, centre-left, apart from one or two kind of, other people that are around. But that's okay, because we need to chew over these difficult things. Anyway, so I'm presenting the talk and results that Gareth gave. Now, Gareth started with a background of the trade union movement, the enormous social improvements that it helped to achieve from the days when children as young as 5 in the early third of the 19th century were working 12-hour days or more for 6 days a week in factories, mills, or they were sent up chimneys to scour them out, dying in enormous numbers. And we all know the story of the Tolpuddle martyrs, highly moral Methodist men who were essentially framed in court in a very, very dodgy legal process, just there to terrorise any other workers who might want to form groups to do some collective bargaining. But that's in the past. The question for us now in the 21st century is whether putting back more and more trade union powers that have been taken away since Mrs. Thatcher are the best route to social prosperity, higher productivity, or even a real change in the balance of wealth and power in our society. And also, another difficult issue, whether some powerful trade union leaders who in the past held far left views and believed in a struggle between the classes, a struggle to death between the classes, had the right to encourage industrial conflicts to force through political change in our society. Anyway, so here are the propositions, what we thought, what we voted, and you'll see that some are controversial. Do you think there need to be some limitations on the right to strike? And we looked at some key services such as doctors, nurses, firemen, police, whatever. What do we think? And yeah, most of us thought there should be some limitations. Not everybody thought that. Do you think that trade unions should have some representation on the managing board of their company so that the unions can better understand the management strategy and pressures for change that are increasingly coming in? I mean, Germany has it. We imposed this on Germany after winning the war. And yeah, most of us thought that's a very good idea. Now we're getting to the hub of it. Do you agree with the old Labour Party Clause 4, which called for the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange? And this core of the old Labour Party was written by the Fabians Sidney and Beatrice Webb in 1918, just after the communist revolution in Russia. Essentially, it's a Marxist blueprint for a command economy. What did we think? No, that's wrong. No. Okay, we got the wrong figures. Sorry, we haven't.
It wasn't just the wrong.
No, it was. No, I mean, the response, which, we haven't had that long to do the graphics for 6 different talks. It's been shoot yourself in the head. But the answer actually was 6.5 no, 1.5 yes. So there are, the 1.5 are the kind of, well, I suppose you could call it old Labour, really, or the old trade union, we got to take back the power. But the big majority were no.
Can you give us names, Simon?
That will be later. Number 4, do you agree with the new Labour Clause 4, which was adopted under Tony Blair in 1995, calling for a community, for us to be a community, in which power, wealth and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few? So different, and we almost all said, actually that's what we believe in, although there was still 0.5 of an old lefty saying that's so weak. Surely we don't want to be doing this. Okay, only two more. Do you think it's good, as Gareth would have done, to encourage workers to believe that they're part of an exploited proletariat who are the natural class enemies of the bosses, and that they should unite to defeat them? Answer. No, again we've got it wrong. So what it should say is no 7 and 2 abstentions. So sorry, somewhere between me and Roger, who worked incredibly hard on incredibly many graphics, but you know the result. You know, we just got the no and yes got reversed. But
I was a bit surprised when I saw that earlier.
Okay, so
questions.
yeah, okay, so it was 7 no, we don't think that's any longer a great idea. And finally, do you think the return to the union powers and mass membership of the 1970s is the best way to bring about the aspirations that almost everybody supported the new Labour Party clause for? Do you think that returning to the 1970s level, I mean, what I've recorded here, again, that's wrong. That's not what we said. We said no 5 and yes 3. So most people thought we don't want to go back to exactly the 1970s. I'm going to make a couple of quick closing remarks. So my personal view, because we all think different things, is that I love trade unions for their historical role and their ability to give individual workers some protection against the overwhelming power of a company. But they do always reflect a sectional interest, and if strong trade unions use their power excessively, it can damage the prosperity of a whole society. Can also have side effects of making their own industry unsustainable in the international competitive market, as arguably happened to large parts of the British motor industry. So I'm very pleased that the majority. We're going to have. So this is my final statement for me. I'm very pleased that the majority of votes for our group were, to my mind, reformist rather than utopian, and reflect a desire to see a flourishing private sector alongside better public services and strategic investments directed by the government. The way I personally see it is that the way forward for a fairer society has to be based on small values like a spirit of generosity, trust and cooperation, recognising people's different skills and abilities rather than a class war. And also that as humanists we share a common humanity with everyone, Jews, Muslims, Albanians, Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever sexuality you have, even mentally, divergence. And that therefore we should have nothing to do with a Lee Anderson style of politics that stirs up anger against any whole group of people. We shouldn't be othering any group of people. Right, okay, thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to one of our presenters tonight. Obviously, they've tried to distill a huge amount of discussion into the talks that we've had, and it's given us a huge amount of food for thought.